"What's going on?" I asked, trying to ease the tension. "Lucas has always been like this," Jake said, ignoring my question. "He comes into your life, creates chaos, and then disappears, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. You see him and think he's special, but he just doesn't know how to stay." Lucas didn't defend himself. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if agreeing. "Maybe you're right, Jake, but that doesn't mean I can't try to change." His words didn't sound defensive, they felt like an admission. "Why did you even come back?" Jake pressed. "You've never cared about family or anything permanent." "Because I wanted to try," Lucas replied quietly. "At least once." The tension around us grew heavier. This wasn't just an argument, it was a collision of two worlds, two opposing philosophies of life. I stood between them, unsure of what to say, afraid that any word might make things worse. When we got back home, Jake went straight to the bedroom without a word. Lucas stayed in the kitchen. I sat across from him. "Do you and Jake argue often?" I finally asked. "Always," he said with a faint smile, though his eyes looked tired. "He thinks I'm a destroyer, and maybe he's right, but you know what's strange? He never stops to ask why I'm trying to destroy things." I wanted to respond but couldn't find the right words, perhaps because I suddenly realized that Jake and Lucas weren't as different as they seemed. They were both fighting for their lives, just in opposite ways. Later that night, I heard Jake moving around the house. He couldn't sleep, just like me. After that tense argument at the cinema, the atmosphere in the house became as thick as morning fog. Jake avoided Lucas, and I felt trapped between them like I was caught on a battlefield. Lucas, however, remained unchanged, calm, unbothered, and perpetually lost in thought. That night, he invited me for a walk. "Come on, Claire, the city's falling asleep, but the night's just beginning," he said, standing by the door in his usual jacket. Jake was in his office and didn't even notice us leave. We wandered through quiet streets bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Austin, which had always seemed so familiar to me, suddenly looked entirely different. Lucas led the way confidently, as if he knew exactly where we were headed. We arrived at an old bridge I'd seen before but never crossed. It was abandoned, rusted railings, cracks in the asphalt, and tufts of grass growing through the fissures. Above us, the enormous moon hung low, its light shimmering on the water below. "You haven't been here before, have you?" Lucas asked, leaning against the railing. "No, I didn't even know you could come here," I replied. That's when I heard it. Something entirely unexpected. Voices. Pure, powerful voices that filled the silence with music, as if the stars themselves had begun to sing. I turned, trying to locate the source, and saw a group of people by the riverbank below. They stood in a semicircle, faces turned toward the moon, singing something that sounded like opera. "It's a local choir," Lucas explained. "They meet here at night. Unofficially, of course. They just sing, for themselves, for the river, for the moon." I couldn't look away. The music was magical, imbued with a strange and profound beauty. It felt so far removed from the rhythm of my everyday life that I found myself feeling both like an outsider and an integral part of something larger. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked. Lucas smiled, looked at me briefly, then turned back toward the river. "Sometimes we need to see or hear something to remember that we're alive." We stayed on the bridge, listening to the music until it faded. As the choir began to disperse, Lucas turned to me, his face calm, but his gaze piercing. "Claire, what makes you happy?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The question seemed simple, but a wave of doubt rose inside me. Before I could gather my thoughts, he leaned in and kissed me. When we got back home, it was well past midnight. Lucas didn't say a word, just headed to bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Jake was already asleep, and I stood at the window for a long time, staring out at the night city. That night changed something in me. It didn't just show me another world. It forced me to confront the question of whether I was truly living the life I wanted or just floating along, too afraid to make a choice. The next morning, Lucas sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee when I stepped outside. The sun was just rising, flooding the yard with soft, golden light. Spot, his striped cat, dozed on the windowsill as if guarding the peace of the morning. "Are you always up this early?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "Only when I'm about to leave," he said calmly, his words hitting me like a cold gust of wind. "Leave?" I tried to hide my surprise, but my voice wavered. Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Santa Fe is waiting. There's something I need to finish there." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were talking about a quick trip to the store. But I knew he meant his documentary, his Chronicle of Freedom. It wasn't just a project, it was his journey, his way of understanding himself. "When?" I asked finally. "Tomorrow." I fell silent, feeling the weight of that word. Tomorrow. Suddenly, everything I had been trying to ignore stood before me. The kiss on the bridge, the questions he'd asked that made me look inside myself, and now this news. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, looking at him. He turned to me, his gaze soft but serious. "Because I wanted to give you a choice. If you want, come with me." Those words hit me like an avalanche. Everything I thought was familiar and stable suddenly felt shaky, like I was standing on sand at the water's edge. The house, Jake, my job, it had all seemed so clear just yesterday, but now I wasn't sure of anything. "I can't just leave everything behind, Lucas," I said at last, but my voice sounded more like I was trying to convince myself than him. "Who says you're leaving it behind? Maybe you're finding something," he replied. His words, as always, burrowed deep inside me, leaving a mark I couldn't ignore. He stood up, leaving his cup on the steps, and headed toward the house. "Think about it. You've got until tomorrow." I watched him disappear through the door, then turned my gaze to the empty street. The day ahead loomed large, filled with questions and decisions. But I knew this wasn't just a day. It was a choice that could change my entire life. Life in Austin always felt cozy to me, like a picture from an old photo album, sunlight streaming across the wooden floors of our home, the soft rustling of book pages in Jake's hands, and a coffee cup perched on our battered kitchen table. Everything around us breathed steady tranquility, but, to be honest, beneath this idyllic surface lay an emptiness. Our evenings were quiet, not because we enjoyed each other's company, but because there wasn't much to say. When Jake announced that his stepbrother Lucas was coming to stay with us, I barely resisted asking, "Why?" They rarely talked, and I had no idea what kind of person this Lucas might be. All I knew was that he was younger than Jake, traveled a lot, and, from what I'd heard, had always been the one to break the rules. On Friday evening, I heard the sound of an old truck pulling up outside. A moment later, a door slammed shut. Through the window, I spotted a man with long hair tied back in a bun and a confident stride. He was carrying a huge crate, and next to him sat a striped cat, hunched and watchful. I cracked open the door to get a better look, and suddenly heard a booming voice. "Are you Claire? Perfect. This is your chance to say you're against cats before I let him inside." I froze in the doorway, unsure how to respond. The cat had already leapt over the threshold and begun exploring our home like it owned the place. Lucas followed close behind, hauling the crate. It looked heavy, but he carried it with ease, as if it were just a toy. "This is," I started, but he cut me off. "Music, memories, and a bit of magic," he said, his eyes sparkling as though he wanted to share this world with us right then and there. "I hope there's room for chaos in your life, because I think I brought it with me." Jake, standing in the corner of the room, nervously adjusted his glasses. "Lucas, maybe you should start by explaining why you're here," he asked. "Oh, Jake, you're still the same." Lucas laughed, as if it were the most ridiculous question in the world. "I'm here to stay. Well, for a while, at least." And just like that, chaos burst into my predictable life. Lucas settled into our home with the same casual ease with which he had driven into our lives. The truck he arrived in remained parked by the curb, its chipped green paint speaking of an era when things were built to last, not to dazzle. His cat, whom he had named Spot, thanks to fur patterns resembling spilled coffee mixed with milk, had swiftly become a full-fledged member of the household. Jake said nothing, but I noticed his gaze lingering on the cat lounging on our sofa, leaving dirty paw prints in its wake. "So, where's the truck from?" I asked one evening as Lucas pulled out musical instruments from his crate and spread them across the kitchen table. "That truck?" He reached for a banjo thoughtfully. "I got it from this strange guy in Arizona. We had a bit of tequila one night and he just said, 'Take it.' So I did." Sometimes people give away their most precious things if you're willing to listen to their stories. It seemed that Lucas's life was a string of such random tales, and his cat? That was an entirely separate chapter. "Did he find you, or did you find him?" I asked, watching Spot deftly leap onto the table and make a grab for my teacup. "At a gas station somewhere between Austin and nowhere," Lucas replied with a grin, holding the cup with one hand while shooing the cat away with the other. "He looked at me like he knew I'd stop, so I did. Now he's my partner." This curious mix of spontaneity and charm instantly drew people to Lucas. Unlike Jake, who was measured, cautious, and always planning ahead, Lucas seemed like someone to whom the rules of the world simply didn't apply. But more surprisingly, being around him made me feel lighter. As if, for a moment, life wasn't so complicated. The next day, I found Lucas in the garden. He was sitting on the grass, strumming a guitar while Spot chased fireflies. His music, simple melodies tinged with both melancholy and hope, hit something deep inside me, an ache I hadn't realized was there. Jake stepped out of the house with a cup of coffee, pausing in the doorway. "Are you always like this?" Jake asked suddenly, looking at his brother. "Like what?" Lucas raised his eyes and smiled. "Like nothing around you really matters." Lucas rested the guitar on his knees and glanced at both of us. "I just know that things come and go. It's like the truck. The key is figuring out what you're willing to take with you and letting go of the rest." In that moment, I realized Lucas wasn't just a guest in our home. He was a kind of disruption, a reminder that life could be lived differently if you let yourself embrace a little freedom. By the third day of Lucas's arrival, our home had ceased to be the quiet haven I once thought of it as. It all began when he spread out old posters and photographs across the kitchen table, pulling them from his gigantic crate. They depicted faces, concerts, and abandoned buildings, fragments of a life I couldn't begin to piece together. "Are you planning an exhibition?" I asked, watching him carefully smooth the edges of a yellowed poster. "Something like that," he replied without looking up. "But instead of a gallery, it'll be our house, tonight." I froze. "You're serious? We've never had parties. We barely even talk to the neighbors." "That's exactly the problem," Lucas said with a mischievous grin, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. By evening, he had transformed our home into something entirely different. Polaroid photos hung on the walls, showing musicians' faces, old theaters, and street artists. In the living room, a projector flickered with jagged, chaotic clips, disjointed yet oddly captivating. Nearby, his banjo stood on a makeshift stage. And then the people came. Not just neighbors, but the most unexpected characters. The bartender from the diner down the street, an artist with purple hair, an elderly musician clutching a battered saxophone. They brought friends, and soon the house was alive with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Lucas was at the center of it all, as if the chaos was his natural habitat. He played his banjo, sometimes upbeat, sometimes contemplative, and his voice had a way of bending time, making everyone pause and listen. I watched him, then turned to Jake, who stood in the corner gripping a glass of wine. His expression was guarded, as though he were trying to shield himself from it all. After the music ended, Lucas approached me. "Come on, there's something I want to show you." We left the house, leaving the guests to savor the remnants of the evening. Lucas led me through the city's quiet night streets, moving with a purpose as if he knew every hidden corner. We passed creaking gates and warehouses until we reached a store with dimly glowing neon letters, rare finds. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of vinyl records, their covers bearing names I'd never heard of. Why did you bring me here? I asked, running my fingers over the edge of an old record. This place is like me, he said. It's full of memories, oddities, and stories no one tells anymore. Later, we found ourselves at an abandoned theater. Lucas slipped inside effortlessly, as though it were his second home. On the stage, bathed in moonlight streaming through a shattered window, he spoke loudly. I used to want to be an actor, but then I realized I liked watching others more. His words struck a chord. I felt my own forgotten dreams stirring beneath the layers of routine I had buried them under. By the time we returned home, it was late. Jake was waiting in the kitchen. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice restrained but taut, like a stretched string. "Just walking," I replied. His eyes flicked to Lucas. "You always do this, don't you? Make everything about yourself." Lucas seemed unbothered by the jab. "I'm just trying to remind people what it's like to really live." That night, I lay awake for hours. For the first time in years, I asked myself, am I truly living, or merely letting the days pass by? On Monday morning, still processing everything that had happened over the past few days, Lucas unexpectedly invited me to breakfast. Jake was at work, and the strange silence in the house was something I welcomed. So, I agreed. We left in his truck, which rattled and creaked, yet somehow felt like a natural extension of the chaos he'd brought into our lives. The cafe he took me to was almost hidden, an unassuming brick building near the railroad tracks. Inside, the air smelled of freshly baked croissants and black coffee. Black and white photographs of trains and landscapes adorned the walls. We sat at a small table by the window, where we could see rusty rails and the occasional train crawling by. Lucas was quiet until the waitress brought our food, oatmeal with nuts and fruit for me, eggs and toast for him. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" The question was so unexpected that I nearly dropped my spoon. "What?" I stammered, hoping he'd elaborate, but he just looked at me, waiting for me to open up. I started to give a surface-level response. Maybe I'd travel more, try something new, but he cut me off quickly. "You're not listening to yourself." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, irritated. "You're answering like you're filling out a survey," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm asking what you really want." His words stuck in my mind like a splinter. I stared down into my coffee, feeling something inside me begin to crack. What did I really want? I couldn't remember. My dreams seemed to have dissolved into the endless cycle of work, chores, and waiting for Friday. "Maybe I just don't know," I said quietly. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his gaze both soft and unwavering. "You don't like your answers. That's good. It means you're getting close to the truth." His words lingered in the air, like an invitation to something bigger. He quickly shifted the conversation, launching into a story about the eccentric owner of the vinyl shop who once tried to prank him by selling a counterfeit record. But I couldn't focus. His question echoed in my mind, and worse. It felt real. On the way back home, Lucas turned on the radio. An old song I hadn't heard in years filled the truck's cabin. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, and I stared out the window, feeling the faint cracks forming in my carefully constructed world. For the first time in a long while, I wondered, what if there was room for change in my life too? The next day, while tidying up in the kitchen, I stumbled upon some strange items from Lucas's crate, a few tapes, a stack of old photographs, and a bundle of yellowed notes covered in tiny handwriting. What caught my attention most was an old video camera with a sticker that read, "Santa Fe Project." I picked it up, feeling a strange shiver, as though I were touching something that wasn't meant for me. "Curiosity is both your best friend and your worst enemy," Lucas's voice came from behind me. He stood in the doorway, smiling as he watched me freeze with the camera in hand. "You've found my secret." "Is this another one of your experiments?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Not quite," he said, stepping closer. "It's more like a chronicle of people who once decided life could be different." He took the camera from my hands gently. For a moment I thought he might be upset, but instead he seemed pleased that I'd shown interest. "So, you're making a film?" I asked. For a few years now, he admitted. It's like collecting fragments of other people's worlds, artists, musicians, wanderers. I record them because they remind me that freedom isn't just a word. His voice carried such honesty that I felt a strange mix of curiosity and envy ignite within me. I thought back to the question he'd asked me at the cafe. It wasn't random. It was how he lived. "Will you show me something?" I asked, hoping my voice sounded calm. Lucas hesitated for a moment, furrowing his brow as if weighing his decision, then nodded. We settled into the living room, and he set up the projector. Flickering images appeared on the white wall. A young woman with bright pink hair painting the side of a trailer in the middle of the desert. A middle-aged man in a giraffe costume entertaining kids on the street. An elderly woman in oversized glasses animatedly talking about her collection of dolls. "These are them," Lucas said. People who decided they didn't want to live within the lines anymore. Each of them had a moment of choice. For some, it was sudden. For others, it stretched over years. But they all realized that living someone else's life isn't living at all. Sitting in the dimly lit room, I felt something stir within me. These images, these voices, their raw authenticity, they made me question how I had chosen to live my own life. When the projector turned off, the room fell into silence. "Why do you do this?" I finally asked. Lucas looked at me, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Because I'm trying to figure out where my story is. And you? Have you ever thought about what yours is?" I didn't respond. Maybe because I didn't know the answer, or maybe because I was afraid to hear it. On Friday evening, Lucas suggested we visit a retro cinema on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that felt frozen in time, an old facade with peeling paint, bright neon lights above the entrance, and the scent of popcorn mixed with something slightly musty, like the smell of dusty film reels. Jake came along, though I could tell the idea didn't thrill him. The movie was black and white, an old French drama. Its plot seemed simple but was filled with a kind of aching beauty. I noticed Lucas watching intently, as if he saw something beyond the frames. Jake, in contrast, sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, as though waiting for it all to end. As we exited the theater, I lagged a few steps behind while the brothers talked. Lucas leaned toward Jake, speaking quietly, his face serious but calm. Jake suddenly stopped. "Do you think you can just show up and change everything?" Jake's voice was louder than he likely intended. I stepped closer as Lucas turned to glance at me as though he wanted to say something, but he stayed silent. Jake stared at him coldly.